Hello, this is Mahnoor, and my topic is ventricular system and circulation of liquor. So, first, what exactly is ventricular system? So, it is a set of communicating cavities within the brain. These structures are responsible for the production and transport of CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, which basically covers the whole central nervous system and provides protection to it. So what exactly are the roles of the CSF? So let's discuss that. So cerebrospinal fluid is basically an ultrafiltrate of the plasma, and it is produced in the choroid plexus, and it is usually found in the subarachnoid space, which you can see over here, which is between the arachnoid and the pia mater. And it usually has three main functions. The first is protection. So it acts like a cushion for the brain, limiting any neural damage in cranial injuries. Second is buoyancy, which means by being immersed in CSF, the net weight of the brain is reduced to approximately 25 grams. This prevents excessive pressure on the base of the brain. And the third function is chemical stability. The CSF creates an environment to allow for proper functioning of the brain. Example, maintaining low extracellular potassium for synaptic transmission. So these are the three main functions of the CSF. Now let's discuss the other important categories. So basically, CSF is produced by the choroid plexus, which is lined by the ventricles are lined by the ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells make up the choroid plexus, which actually produces, or you can say in other words, it basically ultrafiltrates the plasma to produce the CSF. And it is these ventricles, mainly the lateral and the third ventricle, where CSF is produced. Fourth ventricle also produces CSF, but in very small quantity. So let's discuss the anatomy of the ventricles. So the four main ventricles are the two lateral ventricles, which you can see over here, and the third ventricle, and finally the fourth ventricle over here. So these are the four main ventricles uh, uh, involved in the production of CSF. So the first is lateral ventricle. It is divided into two parts, left and right, as you can see here in the picture. And it has it's divided, like it's spread amongst almost whole of the cerebrum. In other words, you can find the horns of lateral ventricles in frontal occipital and temporal lobes. The volume of the lateral ventricle, it increases with age. So you can see uh, how exactly it's placed in the cerebrum. Next is the third ventricle, the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle, and here is the third ventricle, and they're connected by the foramen of Monro, which is over here. And it is situated. The third ventricle is situated between the right and left thalamus. So it's basically between the two parts of the thalamus, the two thalamus on either sides, and in between you find the third ventricle. And the anterior surface of the ventricle has two main protrusions, the recesses over here. The first one is called the supraoptic recess, which is located above the optic chiasma, as you can see in the picture. The other one is next above the pituitary stalk, the infundibulum. So it's called the infundibular recess. So this is about the third ventricle, and you can see the borders mentioned over here for a precise idea about the position of the third ventricle. And it is only one. It's unlike the lateral one, which is in two parts. The third ventricle is only one a as a whole, one thing. Yeah. So next is the fourth ventricle. Third ventricle and fourth ventricle are connected by the cerebral aqueduct over here. Yes, over here. And Basically fourth ventricle lies within the brain stem, at the junction between the pons and the medulla oblongata, as you can see in the picture over here. And from the fourth ventricle, the fluid basically drains into two places: the central spinal canal and the subarachnoid cisterns, which we'll see in the next slide. Next is about the foramina. So the main foramina involved in the ventricular system are interventricular foramina, foramen of Monro, foramen of Sylvius, foramen of Magendie, and the foramen of Luschka. So the first one, foramen of Monro, it basically connects the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle, as I already mentioned, and as you can see in the picture. The second cerebral aqueduct or Sylvius, it connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, so it is basically over here. And the foramen of Magendie it's basically after the fourth ventricle, but it's in the median side, whereas foramen Luschka, it's also near after the fourth ventricle, but it's in the lateral side. So basically, if you see over here, this is the foramen of Luschka, and the median side, which is number 7 over here, is basically foramen of Magendie. So that's how you will remember. And from foramen of Luschka and from both from Magendie and Luschka, the fluid from the fourth ventricle will flow into the subarachnoid space. So they both have basically similar function. It's just that their positions are different. Next is the cisterns, which I mentioned in the past few slides, a few slides back. The subarachnoid space is described as a cistern at points where spaces exist between it and the underlying pia mater. So there are some small spots, not as big as ventricle, but smaller than ventricle, which where the subarachnoid space is greater, and it has an underlying pia mater, which is known as the cistern. So the main function of the cistern is from these cistern from where the final CSF is absorbed back into the blood. So the main the four main cisterns are the chiasmatic or the suprasellar cistern, the peduncular cistern, which is over here, the prepontine cistern, which is over here, the cistern of the corpus callosum. So these are the four main cisterns in the ventricular system. So now the circulation of the CSF. So basically, once CSF is produced at first in the lateral ventricles, and then it fills the cavity there and leaves to enter the third ventricle by the way of foramen of Monro over here. And then from third ventricle, there's more CSF produced in the third ventricle by the choroid plexus, and then from there it moves to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, and very little CSF is produced in the fourth ventricle basically. And then after that, all of this CSF exits the fourth ventricle to either enter the central canal of the spinal cord, or by the foramen of Luschka or foramen of Magendie, they enter the cisterns. And from these cisterns, they are reabsorbed back into the circulation. So basically, CSF surrounds the brain and then leaves by way of arachnoid granulations to enter the superior sagittal sinus and then join back the systemic circulation of the blood. And lastly, the main pathology related to the ventricular system is hydrocephalus, and it is mainly a congenital problem, and it occurs mainly in the newborn babies when there is an abnormal development of the interventricular pathways, mainly the aqueduct of Sylvius or the cerebral aqueduct, and this can result in an obstruction of CSF flow. Then it creates a high amount of pressure in the ventricles above in the cerebrum, which results in the encephalomegaly. That means the enlargement of the brain and head overall. And this is mainly why this occurs mainly in newborns is because their skull sutures are not yet developed properly. So any pressure inserted on the brain or the skull can actually expand it and cause a encephalomegaly, like enlargement of the head. So that's about the ventricular system and the circulation of CSF. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned well.